Hello dear students. In this video lecture, we are going to see fatty acid synthesis. Okay. So the synthesis of fatty acid, we will divide this lecture into two parts. In this part, we will discuss few steps regarding synthesis, and in our next lecture, we will discuss the last actual steps of synthesis for fatty acids. Okay, and before this we have discussed about the general introduction about the fatty acids, what are fatty acid and stuff. Okay, so there are three systems for the synthesis of fatty acids. Directly हम synthesis की तरफ बढ़ते हैं. Okay, actual content involved in the synthesis. So there are three systems for the synthesis of fatty acid. First is de novo synthesis of fatty acid, which takes place in the cytoplasm. Second is chain elongation, which takes place in mitochondria. And third is chain elongation in microsomes. Okay, so we are going to see the first type system called as de novo synthesis of fatty acids, which takes place in cytoplasm. De novo synthesis means what? De novo, actually this word indicates new synthesis, naya. Okay, new synthesis is about the de novo synthesis. Okay, so de novo synthesis means what? New synthesis of fatty acid which takes place in the cytosol of cell. There are different sites of fatty acid synthesis like liver, kidney, adipose tissue, lactating mammary gland, etc. Okay, so these are the sites where fatty acid synthesis takes place and it works in the cytosol of cell. ठीक है, मतलब liver में in the cytosol of the cell, and these are the sites where the fatty acid synthesis takes place in the cytosol of cell. Fatty acid synthesis, it occurs in three phases or three stages. Okay, first is transport of acetyl CoA from mitochondria to cytosol. Second is carboxylation of acetyl CoA to malonyl CoA, and third is reactions of fatty acid synthesis complex. In this video lecture, we are going to see first two phase. Okay, हम first और second phase इस lecture में discuss करेंगे, and the last step which involves last stage which involves the different steps that we will see in our next lecture. Okay, so let's focus on our first step, that is transportation of acetyl CoA from mitochondria to cytosol. Okay, so we will study the diagram. Now this mechanism, this synthesis process, it starts right from here. It starts right from this first step, that we have to transport acetyl CoA to the cytosol. क्यों ट्रांसपोर्ट करना है? बिकॉज साइटोसोल में सिंथेसिस हो रहा है. ओके, साइटोसोल, द सिंथेसिस प्रोसेस इट टेक्स प्लेस इन साइटोसोल. Okay, and in the cytosol, acetyl CoA is not present, is not synthesized. Therefore, there is need to transport acetyl CoA from mitochondrial matrix to the cytosol. अब ये ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कैसे होता है? How actually transportation takes place? And we know that acetyl CoA, it is synthesized from the glucose. ठीक है, it is synthesized from the glucose right from the first cycle of metabolism, that is glycolysis. Okay, in the glycolysis what happened? Glucose is break down into pyruvate. Okay, glycolysis में क्या होता है? Glucose is break down into pyruvate. Further, this pyruvate, with the help of the enzyme called pyruvate dehydrogenase, it converts into acetyl CoA. Okay, pyruvate is converted into acetyl CoA by the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. And this acetyl CoA it takes place in the mitochondrial matrix. ठीक है, ये synthesis कहाँ होता है? In the mitochondrial matrix. Now this acetyl CoA further it is involved in the TCA cycle or citric acid cycle. Okay, acetyl CoA it combines with the citric acid cycle, or it takes part in the citric acid cycle, and there is formation of the citrate. Okay, so in the TCA cycle there is formation of the citrate. So it is the cyclic pathway. Citrate, now this citrate actually it plays very important role. Okay, because this citrate it act as a transporter of acetyl CoA. Why? acetyl A ये खुद से नहीं जा सकता. Okay, acetyl CoA it is not transported across the membrane of mitochondria. It is unable to cross the membrane of the mitochondria. वो मैट्रिक्स में ही रहता है, वो खुद अकेले ट्रांसपोर्ट नहीं कर सकता. Okay, it is unable to transport across the membrane of mitochondria. So it is transported with the help of citrate, and that citrate is obtained in the TCA cycle. Okay, so acetyl CoA it combines with the, or it takes part in the citric acid cycle or TCA cycle, and there is formation of citrate. This citrate transporter it transports the acetyl CoA. Okay, it transports the acetyl CoA from matrix of the mitochondria to the cytosol. Okay, to the cytosol. Now citrate has came. अब citrate ये cytosol में आ चुका है. Okay, citrate of TCA cycle is released out into the cytosol. Now this citrate it get break, or the citrate can be degraded and broken down into acetyl CoA. Okay, citrate can be broken down into acetyl CoA. अब acetyl CoA ये cytosol में आ चुका है. Okay, now further this acetyl CoA it takes part in the synthesis of fatty acid with the use of ATP. Getting my point? So citrate in the cytosol it breaks down into acetyl CoA, and this acetyl CoA further is involved in the synthesis of fatty acid, and this breakdown of citrate takes place by the enzyme called as citrate lyase. Okay, and there is formation of the another product called as oxaloacetate. Okay, there is formation of the another product called as oxaloacetate. This oxaloacetate it further converts into the malate. Okay, oxaloacetate ये further convert होता है malate में by the enzyme called as malate dehydrogenase. Then this malate is further converted into pyruvate, and again this pyruvate enters into the mitochondria. Okay, and then further pyruvate is converted back into the oxaloacetate. So this is the cyclic manner. Okay, ये कैसा है? Cyclic manner है. But our main focus is to obtain the acetyl CoA in the cytosol. हमारा मेन एम क्या है कि हमें acetyl CoA चाहिए cytosol में, by hook or by crook. So how we obtain that acetyl CoA? We obtain that acetyl CoA right from the glycolysis. Glucose is converted into pyruvate. Pyruvate is converted into the we can say acetyl CoA by the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase, and this all the process takes place in the matrix of the mitochondria. Now this there is problem with the acetyl CoA. What is the problem? The problem is that it is unable to transport across the membrane of mitochondria. So it takes place, or it takes the help of the citrate. Okay, so here TCA cycle is run out, citrate is been produced, then citrate is transported to the cytosol with the help of citrate transporter. Then citrate is broken down into two components. First is acetyl CoA and second is oxaloacetate. Acetyl CoA is further used in the synthesis of fatty acid, and oxaloacetate is further converted into malate. Malate is converted into pyruvate. Pyruvate is back converted into oxaloacetate, and then it enters into the mitochondria, and this process takes place in the mitochondria. Okay, so that was our first step for the synthesis of fatty acid. What was it? Transportation of acetyl CoA into the cytosol. Why this transportation takes place? Because cytosol is unable to synthesize acetyl CoA. Acetyl CoA कहाँ produce होता है? In the matrix of the mitochondria. Okay, so that was our first step. So the main component required in the synthesis of fatty acid is acetyl CoA, जो हमें मिल चुका है. Second important component is NADPH. Okay, NADPH. It is a product of pentose phosphate pathway. If you might remember the pentose phosphate pathway, you might have seen this in the previous standards. Okay, so pentose phosphate pathway से हमें मिलता है NADPH, and this NADPH it is produced in the cytosol. ये ऑलरेडी साइटोसोल में ही प्रोड्यूस होता है, इसीलिए इसको कहीं से बाहर से उठाने की जरूरत नहीं है. ओके, NADPH itself is produced in the cytosol, and that is the product of pentose phosphate pathway or PP pathway. Okay, so we require acetyl CoA, NADPH, plus we require the enzyme called as acetyl CoA carboxylase, which will carry out the carboxylation reaction. हम देखेंगे कहाँ इसकी जरूरत पड़ती है. Okay, next we require the enzyme called as fatty acid synthase. This is very important enzyme. Both the enzymes are actually very important enzymes, and these are multi enzyme complex. ठीक है, मतलब क्या, ये सिर्फ एक ही एक्टिविटी नहीं परफॉर्म करते, ये सिर्फ एक ही एंजाइम की एक्टिविटी नहीं परफॉर्म करते, दे परफॉर्म द मल्टीपल एंजाइम्स एक्टिविटी. ओके, सो दिस आर द मल्टी एंजाइम कॉम्प्लेक्स, acetyl CoA carboxylase and fatty acid synthase. So these two enzymes you have to keep in mind. First is acetyl CoA carboxylase, second is fatty acid synthase. What are the coenzymes and cofactors required for carrying out the fatty acid synthesis? Biotin is required, it is the coenzyme. Then NADPH is required. These both are very important component, and these are required in very minor amount, manganese and magnesium ion. Okay, so these are the, just you have to keep in mind two enzyme. One is acetyl CoA carboxylase and second is fatty acid synthase, and two coenzymes, first is biotin and cofactor NADPH. Okay, तो ये चार चीजें आपको याद रखनी है. The next step, the second step involved in the synthesis of fatty acid is carboxylation of acetyl CoA to malonyl CoA. Okay, अब हमें acetyl CoA मिल चुका है. In the first step we have got the acetyl CoA from mitochondrial matrix into the cytosol, and we know that synthesis process takes place in the cytosol. Okay, so I hope up till now it might be clear to you. Don't be confused, it is very simple pathway and quite interesting pathway to learn. Okay, so yes, up till now we have discussed how the acetyl CoA has been introduced into the cytosol, and second we have shown what are the enzymes and coenzymes or cofactors required in the synthesis pathway. अब बढ़ते हैं सेकेंड स्टेप की तरफ. योर सेकेंड स्टेप इज कार्बोक्सिलेशन ऑफ acetyl CoA to malonyl CoA. इट इज़ वेरी सिंपल, मतलब acetyl CoA का कन्वर्जन हो रहा है malonyl CoA में. Okay, and this is not only the one product of acetyl CoA, there are many products of acetyl CoA. So acetyl CoA is converted into malonyl CoA, and that conversion step is known as carboxylation. Okay, that conversion step is known as carboxylation, and it takes place with the help of enzyme called as acetyl CoA carboxylase. Getting my point? So yes, acetyl CoA, this is the we can say structure of acetyl CoA. Acetyl CoA is reacted with the bicarbonate HCO3, and this acetyl CoA, when reacted with the bicarbonate, it get converted into malonyl CoA. And for this process the energy is required in the form of ATP. ATP is converted into ADP plus inorganic phosphate, and we require the coenzyme called as biotin, and this reaction is run in the presence of enzyme called acetyl CoA carboxylase. Here there is addition of CO2, we can say. Okay, so you can see the structure. Here the part which is same, okay, this part is completely same. From here we can say, okay, ये part same है, and okay, here from here, and here there is addition of CO2. Okay, so acetyl CoA is converted into the Malonyl CoA. Okay, so acetyl CoA is converted into the Malonyl CoA. Yes, that is your second step, carboxylation of acetyl CoA to malonyl CoA with the help of enzyme acetyl CoA carboxylase and use of energy in the form of ATP. Okay, नेक्स्ट इम्पॉर्टेंट एंजाइम, अब पहला एंजाइम हमने देखा एसिटिल कोए कार्बोक्सिलेज, जिसका काम क्या था, टू कन्वर्ट एसिटिल कोए इनटू मैलोनिल कोए. नेक्स्ट एंजाइम इज फैटी एसिड सिंथेस. ओके, सो नेक्स्ट एंजाइम इन्वॉल्व इज फैटी एसिड सिंथेस. इट इज अ मल्टी एंजाइम कॉम्प्लेक्स. Okay, it is a polypeptide containing 7 enzyme activities plus it contains असाइल कैरियर प्रोटीन सेगमेंट. ठीक है, मतलब 7 एंजाइम एक्टिविटी है. एक फैटी एसिड सिंथेस, इट इज एन एंजाइम विच कंटेन 7 एंजाइम एक्टिविटीज एंड असाइल कैरियर प्रोटीन सेगमेंट विच इज ऑल्सो कॉल्ड एज ACP. ओके, what are that 7 enzyme activities? पहला है acetyl transacylase, that is known as AT. Second is malonyl transacylase, which is known as MT. 3-keto-acyl synthase, which is known as KS. 3-keto-acyl reductase, which is known as KR. Enoyl reductase, which is known as ER, and thioesterase. So these are very important 7 enzyme activities performed by this fatty acid synthase complex. You have to keep this you have to keep this sequence in mind and the name of this enzyme activities. Okay, ACP contains the vitamin called as pantothenic acid. ये जो असाइल कैरियर प्रोटीन है, ओके, ये जो असाइल कैरियर प्रोटीन है, ये क्या कंटेन करता है? इट कंटेन्स द विटामिन कॉल्ड एज पैंथोटेनिक एसिड, नॉट इन द ओरिजिनल फॉर्म, in the form of 4-phosphopanthetine. Okay, in the form of 4-phosphopanthetine, and this ACP is the part that carry acyl group during fatty acid synthesis. How it takes place, that we will see in our next lecture. So here you have to keep in mind the fatty acid synthase. Okay, the main important thing you have to keep in mind is fatty acid synthase. So fatty acid synthase, it contain 2 main parts. Okay, it contain 2 main part. First is 7 enzyme activity. So these are that AT, MT, KS, KR, ER and thioesterase. Okay, and second, it contains the acyl carrier protein, also called as ACP. Okay, and onto this ACP, it contains the vitamin called as pantothenic acid in the form of 4-phosphopanthetine. And what this ACP does, ACP, it is a part that carry acyl group. The name itself indicates, see, acyl carrier protein, मतलब ये क्या करेगा, carry करेगा acyl group. Okay, during synthesis of fatty acid. Now one more thing is there to consider, that this fatty acid synthase, it is a multi-enzyme complex. Okay, and it is present in the dimeric form. Actually ये active ही dimeric form में होता है. Okay, it is active in the dimeric form. The units are there: ketoacyl synthase, acetyl transacylase, malonyl transacylase. So these are the we can say activities of that enzyme which is present in the dimeric form. This is the monomer, and this is the first monomer, and this is the second monomer. Okay, so it forms the dimeric form of the enzyme, and when it is in the dimeric form it is active. Okay, when it is in the dimeric form it is active, and when it is not in the dimeric form it is inactive. That you have to keep in mind. So that is about the, we can say, deep structure of this enzyme. Okay, so कुछ इस तरीके से ये स्ट्रक्चर होता है in the dimeric form. Okay, this is the structure of the enzyme called as fatty acid synthase, or we can simply say fatty acid synthase complex. Okay, this is the diagram of fatty acid synthase complex, which contains these different units. Okay, and to this there is binding of malonyl CoA and your acetyl CoA. How the binding takes place, that we will see in our next lecture. Okay, so the third step involved is reaction of fatty acid synthase complex. अब यहाँ पर स्टेप्स हमारे शुरू होते हैं. 4 स्टेप्स है, mainly 4 steps है: condensation, reduction, dehydration and reduction. This all the 4 steps we will see in our next lecture, but we will see the general overview of this step. तो सबसे पहले होता क्या है, in the first what actually happens, this disc like structure is nothing but it is your fatty acid synthase enzyme. Okay, fatty acid synthase enzyme है जहाँ पर आपके 7 enzyme units are been present. Okay, so these 7 enzyme units are present. The acetyl group from acetyl CoA is transferred to the Asst group of the keto-acyl ACP synthase. तो सबसे पहले क्या होता है, जो आपका acetyl group है, okay, the acetyl group which is there, it is transferred to the acyl carrier protein. Okay, and this reaction is catalyzed by the enzyme acetyl CoA transacetylase. Okay, this all the pathways, all the steps we will see in our next lecture. I hope the first and second step will be clear to you. In next lecture we will focus just on the third step or the third phase of the fatty acid synthesis. Okay, so that was all about the synthesis of fatty acid. Thank you.